Hi, how's everybody doing? That was wildly unenthusiastic. There you go, I heard a woo. I always tell people sometimes you're allowed to yell in a library, and we're in the basement, so like you could really yell as loud as you want, no one will hear. Well, anyway, thank you very much for being here. My name is Aidan Flex-Clark. I'm the director of Life from NYPL. So all of you who are here in the room, everyone who's watching online, just thrilled that you are with us. I get to introduce not one, not two, but three totally amazing writers. How often do you get to do that? This is my first time. I'm, of course, talking about Eliza Griswold Hahrie Han and Andrea Elliott. They are here to talk about two remarkably excellent books, Circle of Hope and Undivided. Circle of Hope is by Eliza Griswold, of course. Undivided is by Hahrie Han. Both of them look at evangelical churches and ways in which members of their congregation grappled with race. They're both beautifully written, have extremely different outcomes, and read together, they're super illuminating. So hopefully you saw that they're available for sale outside. Perhaps some of you picked them up on your way in. They will be available when you leave as well. And I believe that Eliza and Hahrie are both signing copies of the book afterward. And obviously everyone has a library card? Yes? I will check. All right. Some quiet spots. We're going to check on you later. Books are available with your library card. So if you aren't able to pick it up tonight, you will have more opportunities with your library card. And I truly can't encourage you enough. Both of these books I could not put down. Eliza Griswold is not only a Pulitzer Prize winning author for another one of my favorite books, Amity and Prosperity, but much more importantly to us, she was also a finalist for the library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. And her new book, of course, is Circle of Hope. And then just after I read that and I thought I couldn't put it down, I picked up Harry's book and found another book I couldn't put down, Undivided. And Hahrie is the inaugural director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute, which is a multidisciplinary academic and public forum dedicated to strengthening global democracy by improving and expanding civic engagement and inclusive dialogue, and by supporting inquiry that leads to real-world change. We've been really lucky to partner with the SNF Agora Foundation on a couple of excellent events, most recently on a totally irrelevant conversation about political violence and anti-democratic extremism. I don't know why we were talking about it. They're a wonderful partner, and I'd like to acknowledge in the audience tonight two leaders of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, Andreas Dracopoulos and Vasily Samis, so we're glad to have them with us. They are going to be speaking to yet a third author whose work I so deeply admire, Andrea Elliott. Like Eliza, Andrea is also a Pulitzer winner. Also, more importantly, she's the winner of the library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism. Who needs a Pulitzer? That was for her book, of course, Invisible Child, which if you haven't read, after you've read Eliza's and Harry's books, please go pick it up. It is similarly unputdownable. You know, the world is a smorgasbord of nightmares, actual, potential, but this season at Live, we are trying to bring you moments of joy wherever we can. So coming up in the weeks ahead, we're going to have events with Richard Powers and Marlon James, best-selling poet Ruby Kaur, U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon, the founder of Well Read Black Girl, Gloria Edom, and climate scientist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And one of the best nights of the year, our Halloween costume contest, judged by Tim Gunn and NYPL librarians on October 25th. I saw a couple of mouths open, quite a gate back there. Please join us on October 25th. You are invited to create your best literary-inspired costume, and Tim and librarians will tell you how you stacked up against everyone else. It's really, really fun. And at the end of the year, we're going to do a special event called the Library After Hours dedicated to James Baldwin, who is the subject of a very excellent exhibition uptown at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Harlem, Research in Black Culture in Harlem, and of course, also subject of a display in our Treasures exhibition upstairs. So please join us for that. It's going to be really great. If you're not already on our newsletters, please sign up. That's where you get all the information and your first chance to sign up. That's nypl.org/newsletter. When you walked in, you got question cards. Those are for asking questions. Please write your questions while our guests are speaking, and some of my colleagues will come by and collect them. If you're watching online, you can put your questions in the chat. We want to hear from you wherever they are. So Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you who are here. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your support. And please join me in welcoming our three incredible writers.
Good evening. So great to be up here with the two of you. What a privilege. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so I thought I would just start with a comment, which is, we, the three of us, are here up on stage to have a conversation about two books that, even absent this event tonight, and the three of us could create almost their own conversation to readers as an experience, because they are, you've got two really, really different churches. You've both embedded in them. One is a megachurch, conservative leaning in Cincinnati. The other is a more progressive, grassroots Philadelphia church. And you've embedded roughly around the same time period, which is a time period that saw this nation through some of its hardest moments of recent memory, and really wound up these churches reckoning with these issues in a way that tore them apart. And you saw remarkable things. So before we get into some of those stories, I thought we should maybe hear about the genesis of these books. Maybe we could start. So, Hahrie, your book just came out yesterday, right? Woohoo! Maybe we can start here with just sort of how it all began and why, like what led you to this, and then Eliza.
Yeah. So the book really came about by accident for me. I was in Cincinnati doing research on a ballot initiative in 2016 that was focused on universal preschool. And the ballot initiative was interesting because they won by the largest margin that any new education tax in Cincinnati history had ever won. And it happened in 2016, which was the same year that Trump won Ohio, but the education levy passed with all these targeted resources for poor Black children in the city. And so I was interested in it. I'm a political scientist in my day job, and so I was interested in just from the sort of odd political anomaly that it was. And I went to Cincinnati, and I was doing research, and people kept telling me, if you're interested in this campaign, you really should understand there's this church that's been sending all these volunteers to the campaign, which happens all the time when you talk to campaigns. And usually it means there's 5 people in a basement, with a box of saltines that made a few phone calls, So I nod my head politely and wait. But it turned out that it was hundreds of volunteers that were coming from this campaign. They were very young, they were mixed race, and they were, doing all this work for this initiative. And then when I found out that they came from what was the third largest megachurch in America that happened to be based in Cincinnati, I myself did not grow up in evangelicalism, so I wasn't very familiar with it. And so my image of it from what I knew was that it's this, very conservative tradition. And so I couldn't understand why it was that they were sending all these volunteers to the campaign. And it turned out that all of these volunteers had come out of this program called Undivided, which is what the book focuses on. But what really kind of got me into it was trying to understand the anomaly of what it was about Undivided that was able to animate so many people to get involved in this campaign around structural inequality.
All right, and just to get sort of the name straight, because there's Crossroads, which is the church, Undivided, which is the program, and Circle of Hope is your church. Let's go to you now. But we're going to keep this straight.
Not
yours.
Church.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
First of all, I'm so excited. It is almost eerie how much these books have to say to one another, and I can't imagine a more fun interlocutor. And we're dear friends, so I'm going to try to keep it general enough so everybody can follow. Hahrie's book is so beautifully written, and it is. Oh, I'm talking about my book. Okay, so Circle.
Yours is too. Yours
Circle
is
of Hope
beautifully
came
written.
about because one of the things I respect most about Hahrie's book is that it takes apart the stereotype that all evangelicals are white Christian nationalists, right? Which is an important reality in this election season, that we look at how evangelicalism has been co-opted by the religious right. That's important, but it is not a full picture. And one of our jobs as careful chroniclers of our world and the American religious landscape is to complicate it for our readers. And Hahrie's book does that, and I hope that Circle of Hope does that this too. I wanted to complicate our understanding of evangelicalism by writing about evangelicals who are very much at the margins, who are starry-eyed Jesus followers who come out of the 60s. The history of evangelicalism in America is tied closely to social justice, right? tied closely to abolition and other movements against child labor. And we're looking at the 17th and 18th centuries. So there is a movement within evangelicalism to reclaim that social justice reality. And the Christians that I wrote about, whom even, may not even call themselves Christians, they would call themselves followers of Jesus, a lot of them, they occupy that space. They want to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth in practical, literal ways. And I also, like Hahrie, I don't come from evangelicalism. And I have always been suspicious of this term, like Bible-believing Christians, or well, we take the gospel literally. And I'm like, well, these guys are living in squats in Philadelphia, enacting Jesus' Sermon on the Mount word for word. How is that not Bible-believing? How is that not literal? So kind of questioning the idea of authority and authenticity within Christianity by broadening our definitions and giving a look into very different, heavily tattooed, pierced, Narcanning people in the name of Jesus in the streets of Philadelphia crew.
Okay, usually in this kind of a conversation, we have the conversation at the very end, we land in the place of big takeaways or sort of what the big message is. And I actually want to kind of challenge that a little bit and put it on the front end, because I think it's going to help direct our conversation a little more, to hear just right now what you guys would offer up as a sort of one or two big takeaways of each of your books, and then we'll delve deeper into the weeds.
No, you're the political scientist. You're good at big takeaways. I'm just a journalist. I
don't know if that's fair, but okay. Here's what, so I have a mentor who, so a lot of what I think about in my, in a lot of my work is trying to think about this question of like social change and how we make social change. And especially in this moment when we're so divided, like how do we sort of think about kind of coming people together to enact the change that we want. And I have a mentor who talks about the idea that in order to make change, you have to have what's called a critical eye and a hopeful heart. That it's a combination of those two things together that enable us to critique what we see and act on it, but then also have the hope to be able to make a difference. And I think what I really took away from having spent 7 years with these people in Undivided is that, the work of trying to bring racial justice to an institution as complicated and flawed as like a mega church like Crossroads is not easy, and it's a struggle. But the commitment to engage in that struggle, like that's where the critical eye and the hopeful heart comes from. And so. My book, I think very much like yours, it tells a very winding path of what happens, but the people in the end kind of stay committed because they have that kind of juxtaposition of both the critique and the hope that they bring to the work.
Great, Eliza.
I mean, I don't know. I'm bad at big takeaways. I'm better at, this is like sort of tracing what happened. But I think one of the sort of themes that had emerged in the reporting.
I have a quote.
Oh, go with it. Go. You've got a big.
Churches are messy.
Yes, churches are messy places. That's for sure. Where people come, wounded people come to find solace, and I think that's really important. I mean, I come to that I come to in my experience as a pastor's kid, as a PK, and like there was a point in the book where one of the pastors, her daughter, like a parishioner had brought a muffin or a cookie for her mother, and somebody else ate the cookie, and the daughter was incensed. Who ate my mother's cookie? And I was like, I identify with that. So because that is a takeaway, that being a pastor in this day and age has a tremendous personal cost. And we ask them to be plumbers, we ask them to be social workers, we ask them to be marriage counselors, we ask them to be spiritual leaders, and that is untenable. And I think it's very much linked to our confusion, our allergicness to our ongoing relationship with faith, with organized religion. And I hope what the book does is talk, I certainly, writing for mainstream media and consuming it, we have this idea that everybody's leaving, the church is ending, right? Like America is post-religion. And that's really not true. This category we talk about with the nuns, right? Everybody's on a yoga mat on Sunday now. And just because they don't call themselves Christians or belong in the same way to a church does not mean that they're not following the Bible in innovative ways. So I think one of the takeaways is just to say, the paths that American religion is taking now are very different, and we need to pay better attention because it's easy to write off sort of the death of religion as a social movement where that's not quite right.
Can I just chime in on this
Please,
one? Yeah,
jump
so,
in.
Some data that I didn't know before I did research on this book that on this point about the death of American religion is, so the median church in America has like 100 people or fewer, and they are dying off. But mega churches, which are defined as churches that are 2,000 or more people, they've grown by about 34% over the past decade, and so the average megachurch is getting bigger, and American church attendance has gotten so tilted towards these big churches that the top 9% of churches in America by size contain 50% of the church-going population.
And they are more and more conservative Republican.
There's more, yeah.
So those little churches, Circle of Hope is a small church with less than 100 people, and that by design, because they were trying not to become a megachurch. So when you got to 250, you split. You hived off was the language they used, like little bees, and you started
Into a new cell.
colony.
They call them cells.
They
right?
call them cells. Now, cells is actually, okay, I want to make sure, we're just going to have our conversation, and people can break in when it's just... If we get incomprehensible, cells are actually a unit. So one of the things that's most interesting about Harrie's book that's consistent with mine and does bear more investigation is something called the church growth movement. Yep. So megachurches come out of an idea that really comes out of missionary work in India, which is, guess what? If you try to convert a highly cohesive social group, you're going to have a much better success rate as a missionary. Well, in India, that worked within the caste system, right? So there were, by the very least, racialized dimensions in the very beginning of it. So the church growth movement, which is really behind megachurches today, marries this racist understanding of how a church needs to function with a business model. And that's really a lot of the corrosive. We don't hear a lot about that. We hear a lot about Trump. We hear a lot about Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president t-shirts. But what's really at the heart of that is capitalism, right?
Yeah, because so this is all a history that I learned as I was doing research for this book.
Me too.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because there was the whole rise of the Christian right, which we hear so much about in the news. Was really happening alongside and on the backs of this kind of business-oriented approach where the goal was basically converting more souls. That's the work, and so but it had a very different political orientation, which is part of what I was really interested in because. It's hard to get to 35,000 people if you don't have some heterogeneity, right? It's hard to get to that size if you don't have accept some kind of difference along those lines. And so what that meant for a lot of these churches is there's a lot of avoidance about some of the tough issues like race, and so that's where some of the work of Undivided began to, really push boundaries within what the church and what it was comfortable with.
And it's so interesting because this is a mega church and you found this little enclave within this mass of people, and you have followed these 4 leaders of this very tiny church, and yet you both witnessed these churches come kind of falling apart in moments. Maybe you could just take us through the major plot points of what the kind of narrative arc of your book, what the story shows us. Each of you, just really quickly, if you could just kind of summarize
Well, I can't give it away. Who will buy my scintillating page?
Well, don't give away the.
Okay, so basically,
it is a page turner.
Thank you. It follows 4 pastors, and so does Harrie's book. Not pastors, but 4 people. And I never write this because my wise editor, who's in the audience, suggested I didn't. But instead of saying Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's Johnny, Rachel, Julie, and Ben. And we're following the same story from 4 different points of view. And there is not a single truth. That's kind of the reality. We're watching through, sometimes it's repetitive. There are all kinds of aspects of this plot that are problematic that I could point out. But essentially what it does is it traces the devolution of this church from a sense of we must remain together. And they are classic, as they would say themselves. They're in their communities. They're trying to save their neighborhoods. It's white saviorism, and it's 90s, kind of coming out of a megachurch model. Lots of them grew up in conservative rural churches in America. They came to Circle of Hope. They thought they'd left the problematic theology behind with their chosen new families. And what happens is their work looking outside and doing good work around them, George Floyd hits, pandemic begins, and they feel called, it's a generational struggle as well, to look within and investigate themselves and look at the whiteness. Why, in a city that's 50-50, white and black, Philadelphia, are they 87% white still, right? So that's kind of the question that they're asking themselves and that the book ends up asking.
Right, and so Eliza's book, I had this moment like earlier this year where I was like, oh, this book I've been working on for 7 years is finally coming out. You know, it follows 4 characters in an evangelical church that are trying to do work around justice. And then I was talking to my editor, and she's like, oh, Eliza Griswold has a book that follows 4 characters also doing work in an evangelical church.
I actually worried that Hahrie was going to be like, Jesus, this just came out. Because yes, I worried about this. Yeah.
I was like, well, that's awesome. Okay. Anyway, but it's so exciting to have the opportunity to have the conversation with you. But so my book also follows 4 characters. But it's a very different church. So
very different stories.
Yeah.
Very different.
Complementary.
So different.
Everyone must buy both.
Yeah. But anyways, so it's 4 people who are within this like big evangelical megachurch in Cincinnati. A black man, a white man, a black woman, and a white woman. And all 4 of them get animated to get involved in this work of anti-racism within the church, and for a variety of different reasons. They each have their own kind of journey to wanting to get involved in this work. And the first half of the book essentially traces their journey through this like 6-week program that the church began in 2016 around trying to do racial justice work. And so that program is called Undivided. And so the first half kind of chronicles, how was it that program was able to kind of move them to a place to reconsidering their own assumptions about race in America. And then the second half of the book kind of asks this question, okay, so like once that program ends, which is where a lot of like DEI programs and stuff end, like what do they actually do with it? And really what ends up happening is all 4 of them face backlash for wanting to continue in the work. And it comes from their families, from their fellow congregants in the church, from their workplaces. And the question in ways like what is the scaffolding they need around them to be able to kind of sustain the work in the face of the backlash that they're receiving.
And there are so many moments in both of these books where the reader asks, how the hell did you get that? They feel like very, very intimate accounts of personal reckoning, of marriages breaking down. So let's pivot for a moment to access and just the story behind this story. Eliza and I have talked about this over the years. Eliza is a fan of, talking about immersion journalism with the following kind of, you can tell the story, but just basically the example that you always give is it's as if you are walking up to somebody who's driving a car. This is actually how your book begins, is with this. And you say, can I just ride along with you for a while? But what your book didn't say, but what you said to me was, and then you're still in the car 400 miles later, and they look in the rearview mirror, they're like, you're still in the car. What are you doing here? It's a really bizarre thing to expect of people. So can you just tell us a little bit about how you got in and the kind of hurdles that you faced?
Sure. So, this is Andrea and I sometimes I feel like we're a little newsroom of this. Like we will go, because you hit all kinds of ethical questions and practical questions when you do this work, and you need to turn to friends and be like, I am completely implicated in this situation or that situation, and how do I handle this? And one methodological thing that we've talked about is how you share this material, after which we can talk a little bit. But in this, what I did is I came to the book through one of these young figures who's sort of an evangelical superstar in this progressive world, who was melting guns into garden tools to live out the biblical injunction of beating swords into plowshares. Okay, so he has a mobile forge in Philadelphia. He's like poking AK-47s into it to melt them down. You can imagine, right? Everybody's in like Crocs and button down.
It looks like Jesus too.
He looks a little like Jesus, He makes his own clothes. Okay, so anyway, he's amazing. So all of that said, I came to the church through him. He was kind of at the edge of the church, and he introduced me to a pastor. And then I sat down with the 4 pastors at a pastor's meeting and said, this is what I want to do. They were familiar with what I do, so they had some sense of how that ends up on a page. And we all thought the story was going to be very different. I thought I was basically writing a kooky subculture, positive take on evangelicalism. This is pre-pandemic, pre-George Floyd, pre the racial reckoning and the crisis within the church. So for me, the real challenge wasn't the initial access, which I know how to do.
They would never have agreed to this had they known where it was going.
They would never have agreed to this. And one of them said the other day, I would never say yes again. And it was like a dagger to my heart, But they did say yes because they felt, and they still feel, I have different relationships with each of them, and they have different relationships to the material. But the one I'm talking about, Julie, really took part in this book because she believed that this book was the work of Jesus. They made collective decisions. I showed up. They made the collective decision to allow me in. And all of them allowed me, despite the really changing stakes of the book, to continue through. And I think that speaks to their integrity.
What about you?
Yeah.
Hahrie?
So when I first started working with them, I didn't anticipate that I was going to write a book. I was doing research on this preschool campaign, and here's a sort of little interesting side story about it. And so I went in kind of thinking it was going to be, typical kind of academic research project that I was working on. And so when I first entered into that conversation, it wasn't in the context of I'm going to follow you for 7 years and get to know the intimate details of your life.
And you write about this, that you were coming in as an absolute outsider, as a member of the coastal elite.
Yep.
As a lapsed Catholic.
Yes, I was worried that they would be resistant to talking. I'm a professor at a fancy university on the East Coast. I'm not evangelical. I was raised Catholic. I'm a lapsed Catholic. In Cincinnati, the demographics are very white and black, and so I'm Asian. I didn't fit into any of the categories that they were focused on. And what I was interested by was that all the early conversations, they were just tell us about you. They didn't care about the research. They didn't care what I want to do. They just want to get to know me. And so, and the fact that I wasn't evangelical, that was no problem, because actually one thing that was funny is every time I'd be well, I was raised Catholic, and they'd be say no more. Yeah. Totally understand why you'd want to leave that behind, So that part was the easy part, and then we would just talk about
I just tell people I'm a collapsed Catholic, just
that's
so you know.
That's a good word. I should use that. I didn't know that at the time. But yeah, that was the easy part. The part that I will say was, I think, trickiest in most of my conversations is, so my youngest child identifies as gender fluid. And, gender and sexuality issues are very challenging, and, within certain conversations. And so, at a certain point, if you're a woman, I think people always say oh, well, do you have a family? And I say, oh yeah, I've got 2 kids. Oh, are they boys or girls? And then, I would say well, it's complicated. I have a daughter, and and I would answer very honestly, and people would get visibly uncomfortable, And but what I really respected about those conversations is that they would often name it. And then we would decide together how we wanted to handle it or not, And so sometimes they would say, that makes me uncomfortable, or they'd say, I don't even know what that means. Can you explain what that means? Or, I don't believe that's real. There were just lots of questions that would come. And, I'd say, well, I'm a mom, and I'm defending the integrity of my child. And we would have that conversation, And sometimes it would happen over the course of several interactions. But I think it was what they wanted to know is that I was willing to put into the conversation as much as I was asking that they put into it, And once we were able to establish that, then we were able to kind of, go further. And then at a certain point, it became clear that maybe there is a book here to be written. Then I felt like I had to go back and have a different conversation to say, is this something you'd be willing to be a part of?
That's really interesting, because you both write about the experience of sitting with discomfort and the sort of necessity of that in anti-racism work. And I imagine, I know as a reporter that when you hit those spots, when the kind of lens is turned on you and you're having to answer the questions, that that in a way deepens your understanding of them as well. You can suddenly see into parts of their life that you didn't really know about before. So it's such a relational thing, right?
It's totally, yeah. And to me, like, that's part of what I took away from the book is that, like, this work is struggle. You know, like, bridging across these differences requires struggle. And I think so often, you know, we're trying to find, like, the right little nudge or the right little intervention or the thing that you can do that's going to, like, solve these problems. And that's not what they were doing, is they were committing to the struggle. And the commitment to the struggle is what really, I think, animated and made work, but also raised a lot of ethical questions along the way.
Like what? What are some of the ethical questions that it raised?
So for me, the moment, and this, I'd actually be really curious to see how you all react to this. So one of the characters in the book is a Black woman, and I write using a pseudonym for her, which, you know, I put in the book. And she was the one person who asked me to use a pseudonym. And part of what happened over the course, we didn't know this obviously in the beginning, is she and her husband ended up getting divorced. And, you know, because of things that were going on in her personal life, at some point she wanted to withdraw from the project. And, you know, as I'm trained as an academic, we have to always go through, like, human subjects review. And, you know, there's, like, a whole history in academia of academics having done terrible things, you know, without having gotten consent from their subjects. So things like the Tuskegee experiments and things like that. And so, you know, I'm very trained in this model of, like, the first thing when you're doing research is, like, you do no harm to the, you know, the people. And so anyway, so we had been in, like, I don't know, probably like 5 years of conversation. She was a central character in the book. I had a book contract. There's all these things. And she's like, I'm pulling out of the project, you know? And I was like, oh, like, well, that's challenging, but like, I totally respect that decision, you know? And it's like, the last thing I want to do is write a book that's going to feel harmful to you. And when it was interesting to me because, like,
Can we just pause for a
Yeah.
moment, because this is actually just occurring to me, but sort of obvious in retrospect. I mean, you're coming at this subject as an academic where you have a process where you have to be basically approved by an IRB,
Yep.
right? Which is a very different process. It's academia than we go through. Basically, our review board is an editor, or maybe sometimes just each other. We have protocols, but we don't have the same kind of limits, I think, placed on our work. And I mean,
so I had, like, an explicit IRB. You know, if a research subject, like, withdraws from the study, you can't be like, you have to stay. You know, like, that's just
Right.
not allowed. You know, and
you can't work them.
Right. And so, so I'm having, like, a conversation with my editor on the one hand, I'm having a conversation with her on the other hand, you know, and I was getting advice from all these people. And this is one of those places where a lot of my journalist friends had a very different reaction than a lot of my scholarly friends who were like, walk away, like, you can't do it. You know, there's nothing you can do. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of my journalist friends were saying, like, you've put in as much on this project as she has, you know, and there's a story here, you know, can you, like, have that conversation, you know, with her? And what ended up happening is that, like, I didn't really push her, but then she kind of came around in a different way, and so then she is still in the book, and we were able to kind of, like, keep it. But she asked for certain things like having a pseudonym and things like that, and so we had to kind of negotiate out the terms on which she would stay a part of the project. But she came around to it. But it was one of these moments where I realized, like, it is really tricky when you get into someone's life and are kind of given the gift of someone else's story. You know, how do you hold that in a way that honors, you know, what they're giving to you?
Any ethical quandaries you want to share?
Sure. I mean, I feel like that's kind of the essential conversation that Andrea and I have all the time, which is, I mean, that's our life, right? We've done this for decades, and we work with people who, like, the power differential is extreme. What we see is extreme. How do you work with a vulnerable source as opposed to a sophisticated source? I mean, those are some of the questions that we share. With this, the book ends. I tell a little bit of the first person I talk a little bit about what was happening for me in my family and losing my dad at the end of the book. I only did that because one of the pastors said to me, "Why are you not in this?" And I come from a tradition in which the absence of the vertical pronoun is the highest ethical, right? So I don't see putting myself in as a gift of generosity. I mean, I'm telling somebody else's story. That's the gift, right? And she really challenged me, like, why am I in there and where are you? And so that it changed the end of the book. That I was like, okay, you want to know why I wasn't in church today? And so that was kind of an ethical dawning for me. You know,
It's actually probably one of the most powerful moments in your book is the very end, where you are leaving the church after your father's funeral, and you see Julie, the pastor, standing there. You did not expect her to be there, and for the first time in your experience writing this book, they have entered your life, and you both break down and hug each other, and it's just a really beautiful moment.
well, I mean, to talk a little bit, because I mean, I know some of these stories of Andrea's, but like when you work with people over so many years, they see like, I mean, in that Miami book, I mean, I'll just say this, but it didn't end up happening, but I thought I was going to need like hormone shots for fertility. And the woman I wrote that book about is a nurse, and she's like, I'll just give them to you. Just like come down, right? And like, you know, the moment that I often share is like this false narrative of like, well, I'm just a fly on the wall. We have to own more and more what the impact that our presence makes on a story. And we can talk about like particle physics and how things like particles observed move differently. But like there are moments in this book that unfolded the way they did because I couldn't stand the fact that they weren't talking directly. Like what happened in this story is these guys, all four, would talk to me about their grievances, and they were legitimate. And then they would get into a meeting and they would just clam up. But I knew the nature of their authentic grievance, and there are definitely moments where I overstepped and would be like, Kelly, talk to one another, right? Which are ethical, you know, those are boundaries that I crossed.
There's this moment, Hahrie, because when I talk about power and the relationship that it has to your stories, in 2017, when Chuck, who is the black pastor who co-founded the Undivided program at Crossroads Church, gives a sermon in which, for the first time, it seems, he really like lays bare his anger. And this is prompted by the news that a white police officer has not been convicted for killing an unarmed black man, and he tells the church, I don't know if I can stay in a white evangelical space if my white brothers and sisters are not grieving with me in this moment. And he gets huge applause, and I can't imagine how thunderous that was, because, I mean, how many people show up? It's 25,000 members.
It's a multi-site church, so they had, in that auditorium, they had about 4,000 people.
It's a lot.
But people are upset, and of course, he ruffles feathers, and he catches wind, or he intuits that the church's leadership, this is actually one of my moments of like, I had to read it a couple times to make sure it was spiritual board, capital S, capital B, like, is watching him now. I know, like, if anyone ever told me that the spiritual board was watching me, I would just like surrender. I would surrender. I guess I'm just curious, and then he talks later on about power in that context and how kind of limiting it is. Can you talk a little bit about what that moment meant in terms of anti-racism and power and structure in the church? And also, Eliza, I'd like to hear about power in your church.
Yeah, so just to put a little bit of context, so Chuck is was the highest ranking black pastor at Crossroads. He originally grew up in Philadelphia in the black church, and he ended up in Cincinnati because he was originally working for Procter & Gamble, and then eventually left Procter & Gamble to join the ministry and become a pastor. And when he first joins Crossroads is about 80% white, 20% non-white, and so he's a very gifted preacher. I mean, we were just doing an event together last night, and he moves the room, you know. And so he became very popular, but he never really took issues of race head on, you know, and that was very different from what he was accustomed to, having grown up in the black church. And then there's this unarmed shooting. There's a police shooting of an unarmed black man in Cincinnati. It kind of cleaves the city apart. And so he feels like he has to, you know, kind of increasingly sort of speak out more. And so he gives this one sermon, And the language that he used, he actually just talked about this last night when we were at the event together, is that he felt like that was the first time that he told his congregation that he's really black. You know, that like up until then they were like, he's Chuck the pastor, but now all of a sudden they're like, whoa, he's really black, you know? And he, and I think, and then so what happened afterwards, he gets a very divided reaction from the congregation. Some people are cheering and really supportive, and other people are really pushing back on him. But then at a certain point, the spiritual board, which is the governing body of the church, comes and sends someone to go and talk to him, and they don't sanction him in any way, but they kind of say like, how do you think that went? You know, and sort of, what are you thinking about now? You know, and they kind of ask those kind of questions that kind of just give him a sense that they're watching.
It's chilling. A little.
And he sort of says like, well, you know, that's when I realized like this is how power flows in the church. You know, when I was just good, happy Pastor Chuck, and I gave a sort of healing message after 2016, you really loved me, you patted me on the back. But now that I'm telling you that I'm really black, like, and I'm angry at what's happening in America right now, you're coming.
And when he invokes power, what he's really talking about is his supposition that people who've given a lot of money to the church are the people who are calling and complaining. Those are the people with power, and the spiritual board actually may be a very benevolent thing and just is trying to play diplomat here and doesn't want to lose its funding. But this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
When it comes to this kind of outreach or work or message, right?
Yeah. So just
and you saw this too, Eliza, in your church.
Just one thing on that.
Yeah.
So Crossroads, the church, like has this like ambivalent relationship to Undivided that kind of tacks back and forth. And so the first time Chuck gave the sermon saying he had to do work on race that sort of called people out, the next week the head pastor, who's white, comes and says, if any of you are upset about what Chuck said, like, I want you to know that I 100% stand behind him, you know? And so he gave him like full-throated support for the work that he was doing. But then you also have moments like this that come a couple years later. And so there's a constant kind of like tacking back and forth that happens in the church, which I think is reflective, as you're saying, of like the tensions that they were feeling between big donors who may be more conservative, you know, people who want to focus on it, and so on.
And in a couple of minutes, we're going to open up for questions. But Eliza, when reading your book, I think a lot of people have said this about it, including, I can't remember who reviewed it. Maybe somebody at the New York Times reviewed it and said this as well, that you think you're going into a book about a church and you wind up feeling like you're reading about your own family or just your neighbors. It really holds up a mirror to America. And George Floyd in particular, that moment just cleaves apart the leadership in a way that's really, really pivotal. Can you talk about
Sure.
that?
I mean, I that was what I hoped that people would take away, was that this was as present in the Audubon Society. Like, this was the reckoning of our time, right? And continues to be. And I sometimes talk about, like, I can tell when I'm talking to an audience where the community I'm talking to has been through one of these experiences, because everyone gets a little nervous when I'm like, and this reckoning, people are like, you know, because we all had them. We had them in our families. We had them in our workplaces. We're still having them. How does power work? Who has the right to speak? What is the language that we're going to use? Is it going to change again? What is virtue signaling? What is authentic? So those are the questions that the book really asks. I mean, a lot of what's happening with power here is that we have, you know, white hippie church planners who've come from Southern California and believe that they have sort of solved the problems. They've transcended the questions of race and equity in bringing about the kingdom of heaven on earth. And then we have a new generation of millennials who feel very different than their boomer and Gen X predecessors and are like, you didn't do anything, right? So it's that confrontation, which I think all of us, I mean, I certainly, as a Gen Xer, and I think that actually helped in reporting the book, because I could identify with both of those polarities and felt implicated by them all.
Okay, questions from the audience. Was there anything you discovered during any of the interviews that you deemed too sensitive to include, but apparently you can share it with the audience and the live stream?
Absolutely, 100%. That happens all the time, that we respect those boundaries. That with work like this, it's not it's not, oh, I'm on the record, off the record. You're in people's lives, you're in their families, you see their children, you learn things about their children that they may not want the world to know, that may be harmful to children. Those are boundaries and ethical lines that we follow all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say 100%.
Mega churches are on the rise, especially in the South, and oftentimes are an echo chamber of cultural identity. How can the practices of Undivided be promoted across different regions?
Yeah, so Undivided started as a program within the Crossroads Church. It has since, and this is a very common thing that they do, they since spun it off to its own 501c3, so it's now working with a lot of churches in different parts of the country. It also has a secular version. They've done work with different companies and do things in workplaces and other things. So I know that the places where I think they've gotten more traction have been like around the Midwest, essentially, which is where they're located. But they've been working with churches in Texas and I think one in Alabama and other things. So they are trying to do it. One thing I should be clear about, though, is that I don't argue, I hope, in the book that this is like the perfect program and it's going to like unlock, racial justice in an organization. It's one of there's a whole menu of different programs within the church world that are trying to work on these kinds of things, and this is one of those. But I do think that part of where they were able to make traction where other programs were not was because there was this commitment to kind of carrying people through this journey that went beyond that initial 6 weeks, and so it was it's that ongoing sort of journey that really is where the rubber hits the road, as you said.
But I also thought their ground rules were amazing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Their ground rules were not like DEI, you had to really be willing to be uncomfortable, right?
And the ground rules really come out of the culture of Crossroads, which has they have ground rules like belonging comes before belief, so they have this sort of motto that even if you whatever God you believe in, if you believe in no God, our God, whatever God, you're welcome in our community. So there's a community of radical belonging. They have a culture of risk that is very common. One of the things that they say all the time is we have a big back door, which means that they're not just doing growth for the sake of growth. If you don't feel like this is, if you're not willing to be uncomfortable, this is not the place for you. And so they create that culture that they then brought into Undivided, and they explicitly stated that at the beginning. So,
okay, remind the audience, or I don't think you guys actually have even made this clear, what the sort of racial makeup of these congregations is.
So
roughly,
80% white,
80%
20% non-white. Yeah.
I would say this Circle of Hope is 85% white. And yeah.
How might your books have been different if you had investigated churches with more diverse or majority African American or Latino congregations?
So, I mean, the questions would have been different. The Black church has really wrestled, this division that both Hahrie and I write about between people who think, well, is this a work of a church? This is church and this is worldliness. The Black church doesn't ask those questions. They haven't had the liberty of doing that. By definition, since their existence, survival has been about material reality as well as spiritual reality. And so it is actually Black churches, and there's many, many wonderful theologians in this space. Jamar Tisby is one of them, who told me the other day, the Black church was on to white evangelical racism we could see what was going, and Hahrie actually writes about that and this Lausanne Accord very early on that you're seeing the problematic racism of white evangelicalism enshrined as it rejects the rest of the world. So those would be different books, and the questions in those communities are very different. It's not even something that is the supposition,
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that there are, I think, more churches that are starting to pop up that are trying to be really kind of evenly divided. So it's not a predominantly Black or predominantly white church, but are sort of more. But there's a book by a woman named Corey Edwards, who I write about in the book, where she herself was a Black sociologist of religion, and she herself was a person of faith, and she went out to try to do a study of racially integrated churches. This is in early 2000s, and she ends up writing a book called The Elusive Dream. because her argument is that she went out looking for a church that really could kind of like integrate, and she felt that it was really elusive. And so I think it still continues to be a challenge. If most churches tend to be there tends to be a racially dominant group.
And it's Martin Luther King Jr. who wrote in the Times like that the most segregated hour in America was Sunday morning, right? So, and in the church I wrote about, that was an argument as to don't you dare come and tell us that who's in our pews is the definition of anti-racism. Like there isn't more that's performative in itself. So people are asking interesting questions about this that have unusual answers.
Yeah, right. Totally. Okay, how are your relationships with the people you've interviewed gone since the book's publications? And do you see it changing based on the reception of the books? That's a good question. I mean, how did they respond to the books, to each of your books?
So this might be a fun moment to talk about the method that Andrea and I use, which is for the last book, for the Amity book, I didn't know what to do to write about a woman people who don't have experience of having immersion journalists come live in their houses and get to know them. I was very aware. So in journalism, we don't share what's on the page with anybody in advance. You don't give somebody a copy of something to read, but you can read portions to them. You could read all of it to them. And what happened with my last book is that I didn't know how to make sure that if I wasn't brave enough to read this aloud to a human being who I'd written about sitting at our kitchen table and looking into her eyes, I shouldn't be writing it, right? Mm-hmm. So Andrea and I have talked about this method over time and used it. So that's what I did this time around. And what was excruciating is the behavior of these 4 pastors is not good in this book. There are F-bombs, they're turning off their Zoom screens, they're screaming. And they had to relive that in the hearing of the book. So it's often not sympathetic portrayal, right? It's not just like, this was a hard time for you. It's this behavior is really bad, right? They did that. They went through a really rigorous fact-checking process on top of that, and you just think of the hours they invested in these projects as well. I have different relationships with all 4 of them, as I did throughout the reporting of the book, and I said to them as we went on, your reaction to this book will not be what you read in it. You will respond to this book how people around you respond to it. You know, if your husband doesn't like this book, you're not going to like it. Like you cannot. That's how people respond to writing. They don't respond like, well, you wrote this. They may love it, and then the people around them are going to influence that reaction. So we're still working through some of that. I was on the phone with a member of the church today because the church dies sort of at the end of my book, but a little bit of it is lived. And she called me today and was like, well, I want to tell the story of how the church lives. Where am I going to tell that? And I was like, okay, this is my responsibility to you. Like, let's talk about how are you going to tell that? And you want to tell it. You don't want me to tell it. She's like, yes. Right? So, anyway, it's ongoing. It's alive. These are people moving through space and time.
Okay, and I'm very curious, does the IRB allow you to read your portions of your writing?
Actually, I had like a long kind of like process I was trying to figure out like what can I do, because similarly as a researcher you're not supposed to you don't like let your subjects determine like what it is you're going to say. And I think Andrea actually was like reading your notes from Invisible Child where I was like, oh, I can go and read aloud the relevant portions. And so after learning from you, like that's what I went and I did, and they fact checked it with me and things like that. And so I felt comfortable because I certainly didn't want to say anything that was factually wrong. But had a similar thing where they were all like there were moments where they grimaced, because all of them, like this is hard work and we're not all proud of how we behave in some of our toughest moments. And so, but they all stayed committed to the work and and so I'm still the book just came out yesterday, so they have yet to have the experience.
Oh, just wait.
Yeah, I know. So right now we're all friends, and so things are all good. I will say, like, I remember the woman, Sandra, who she was the one that had the kind of ambivalent relationship to the project. Near the end, I remember having a conversation with her. She was like, is this it? Like, are we done? Like, it's been 7 years of, like, me being, like, her interlocutor and hanging out with her and her family and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, no, I don't think we're done. Like, I think we're friends, And so, we've continued to stay in touch even, and we'll see, I think, as the book comes out, like, how they continue to feel about it.
It's part of the responsibility. Like, what is my ongoing responsibility to the people I tell stories about? We know that as journalists all the time, often in more extreme situations than these.
We're going to go a little quickly here because we have a few minutes left. Why is there not a religious left like the religious right?
So, actually, can I jump in on that also?
Sure.
So here's a factoid that I'll give you. What is the most politically active religious group in America, if you had to guess? I'll tell you. So the most politically active religious group in America is atheists, right? The second most politically active religious group in America are white liberal Christians. Yeah, and if you look at the number of political acts that they get involved in, it's like double that of white conservative Christians and black Christians, you know.
I'm going to drill into those numbers, but not till we get off the stage.
And so I don't talk about this in the book, but anyway, so this is a way of saying that. And so when I was first looking at some of this data, I remember I emailed one of an evangelical pastor I know, and was like, what do you think about this data, and like, why is it like that? And he was like, it totally makes sense to me, because the problem is that the white liberal Christians are doing a lot of activity, but it's not organized, right, through relationships and institutions that sort of project it into politics, whereas like conservatives are engaging in less activity if you ask them just like the number of activities that they're taking and the actions that they're taking, but it's all connected through a set of relationships and institutions and so on that project it onto a political landscape in a different way. And so so I think that the question of the religious left, you know, is complicated depending on what you mean by the religious left. And then of course there's also a lot of, you know, there's a scholar at Carleton College named Wes Markowski who has this whole idea of what he calls other evangelicals, which would very much fit the kind of church that Eliza profiles in her book, which are people that you know, might believe the faith tenets of evangelicalism but don't at all adhere to the
This
political
is
identity.
essential because everybody, the other evangelicals who we're banking on in November to peel away. This is a major move now.
Right now, Trump has 82% of white evangelicals.
85.
85.
Yeah, 85.
Self-identified evangelicals, right? So some people might identify as like Christ follower or something. But yeah.
So, but within that, the question is, are there those other evangelicals? Are there people who are willing to move away? Not because of questions of Trump's immorality, which really doesn't move the needle at all, but because of questions of, is this the person who represents my public witness? Can I stand behind what's happening here? So there is movement away from this, but it's complicated. I would say if you want to follow the religious left, you want to follow Jack Jenkins at the Religious News Service. He's written beautiful books about the religious left, and there's plenty of history there. They don't speak in sound bites. They're not good. They have no smoke machines and mega churches. But as a child of the religious left, they're doing their work in their quiet way.
His book is great. He's got a great history of like how it's evolved in the 20th century. So.
Okay, what did you learn from writing your books about how to organize people outside of churches or what not to do?
Okay, I will answer that because yesterday I had I taught Matt Desmond's class, and I brought one of the figures in the book as a fifth person, Bethany Stewart, who's a Black Lives Matter organizer. And she creates these incredible events for the Philly Bail Fund called Turn Up, basically Turn Up to Bail Out, right? And she says she centers those around Black joy. But she says all organizing work must be centered around joy. Let the issue be secondary, but the joy be deliberate with.
She's a very memorable character in your book.
She's incredible.
Yeah.
So I'll say, so what I was going to say is, which I think is resonant, is this idea of belonging coming before belief was really powerful, you know, because I think so many of our political organizations are organized around belief coming first, right? Yeah. If I'm an environmental organization, what do? I go out and recruit other environmentalists, right? So first you must believe, and then we invite you into community of belonging. And, you know, because the church is interested in conversion, they're like, you're welcome no matter what you believe, right? We're going to try to evangelize you, but like, you're welcome. But that notion of belonging, I think, is an important organizing lesson. And then the other thing that I'll just say is that, you know, we talked about the cells before, and in Crossroads, they call them sort of small, or they call a version of it small groups. And I think one of the questions in organizing is always about how do you get to scale. And I learned a ton about how you scale something within a church like Crossroads, but a lot of it depended on having a human-scaled place where people could rehearse what it meant to act with others, you know, and then connect those little small groups to each other through this like honeycomb of structure in the church.
I'm going to just read these last two questions, and you guys pick which one you want to answer. Did you get any words from God? After finishing the book, did you change in the sense of the faith? And to what extent do you feel that people in these churches occupy cognitive dissonance with some of their teachings? How does that exhibit itself?
Well, I'll just say on the terms of, did you get any words from God? I myself did not get words from God, but I will say there's a great book about people who feel like they hear from God by a woman named Tanya Lerman called When God Talks Back, that I highly recommend, where she immerses herself with a group of charismatics who sort of, think about like actually hearing God's voice as being the God and as being the guide in their life. It's a lovely, lovely account. What was the other question? There was
Cognitive dissonance.
Oh yeah. I feel like I experienced a lot of cognitive dissonance, but like we're all flawed and contradictory humans, and so I don't know that felt like it was unusual. It's just that they were willing to grapple with it in a way that's kind of brought to the surface for all of us.
I'm going to answer a different question, which is, I think one of the things that struck me so much with Hahrie's book was the incredible graciousness with which she writes, and it's a rigor, it's authenticity. She's not pulling punches, but it is incredibly gracious book, and I think that you can feel that muscle working, but that's also the lens through which she looks, and it is really an incredible book, and maybe that's God.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great
You're the first person to ever
place
say
to
that.
end. I actually wrote this down that because this was so moving, you said one of your big takeaways was this idea of justice as a form of grace, and that everyone deserves it. Okay, on that note, I think we're ready to wrap it up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.